Eli walked for miles after leaving the settlement, his boots crunching the snow beneath him, each step pushing him further away from safety. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The world was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in on him, suffocating, making him feel like he was being watched. He wasn't sure what he was searching for, but he knew he couldn't stay in River's Edge. The settlement was a reminder of a life he no longer wanted, of the ties he couldn't form, of the way people needed to hold on to things they couldn't protect. Nightfall came quickly, and as the temperature dropped, the forest grew colder. The air turned brittle, like glass breaking with every exhale. Eli found a small, hollowed-out tree to shelter in, wrapping himself in his worn-out coat and tightening the straps on his pack. He tried to sleep, but the exhaustion from the journey kept his mind restless, every crack of a twig or rustle of branches sending him into alert mode. It was well past midnight when he heard the first sound, a low growl, distant but unmistakable. His body went rigid and his hand instinctively reached for his rifle, fingers trembling. Another growl came, closer this time, followed by a scraping noise, like claws dragging over rock. Eli's heart pounded in his chest as he peered through the trees, scanning the darkness. The moon hung in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the snow-covered ground. That's when he saw them. Shadows, tall, thin, impossibly long limbs moving with jerky, unnatural grace. There were 3 of them, weaving through the trees like predators, their glowing eyes scanning the area. The creatures had come for him. He didn't wait for them to close the distance. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he stood, grabbing his rifle and quickly loading it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. The creatures were fast. Too fast. One of them darted forward, its clawed hand reaching toward him. He fired, the shot echoing through the woods, but it missed. Barely. The creature screeched, its jagged teeth bared, eyes wide with hunger. Eli spun to his left just as another creature lunged at him from behind. It knocked him to the ground, the weight of its body pinning him in place. He felt its cold, rotting breath against his neck, and its claws scraped his cheek as he struggled to bring his rifle up. "Get off!" Eli grunted, shoving the creature's chest with his shoulder. With one final heave, he managed to free himself, scrambling backward on the ground as the creature's claws raked through his coat. He fired again, this time hitting the creature square in the chest. It stumbled back, its screech turning into a gurgling, inhuman sound as it fell limp to the ground. But the other 2 were already closing in. The air around him grew colder, like a storm was coming, and the creatures seemed to thrive in the chill. Eli's breath came in ragged gasps as he scanned the dark forest. He needed to move. He needed to get away before they overwhelmed him. The remaining creatures moved in tandem, their movements synchronized in a way that made Eli feel like they were playing with him. One of them circled to his right, its claws tapping softly against the frozen ground. The other advanced directly, its eyes glowing like twin embers in the dark. Eli took another shot, but the bullet whizzed past, too far to hit. He cursed under his breath, retreating deeper into the forest. His legs burned with the effort, the cold biting into his skin with every step. He wasn't sure if he could outrun them, but it was his only choice. The creature that had been circling lunged at him again, this time faster than before. Eli rolled to his left, narrowly avoiding the creature's claws as they sliced through the air where he'd just been. He swung his rifle around, but the creature was already gone, darting back into the shadows. Suddenly he felt a sharp pain in his side. One of the creatures had gotten too close. Its claws had slashed across his ribs, ripping through his jacket. Eli gasped, clutching his side as blood seeped through his fingers. He staggered, almost falling to his knees, but he pushed himself forward, forcing his legs to move. The remaining creature was close now, too close. It grabbed him by the shoulder, dragging him back into the cold darkness. Eli's rifle fell to the ground with a dull thud, out of reach. He was defenseless. Panic surged through him, but he fought against it, reaching for his knife. He didn't have much time. With a grunt, he twisted in the creature's grip, driving the knife into its arm. It howled, its teeth snapping at him in fury, but Eli didn't let up. He twisted the blade, pulling it out with a sickening tear. The creature's arm flailed, the wound leaking a thick, dark liquid. The creature released him, its hand moving to its injury as it staggered back. Eli took a deep breath, ignoring the pain in his side. He was bleeding, tired, and running out of options. In a desperate move, Eli lunged for his rifle, grabbing it just as the creature recovered and charged at him. He fired, hitting the creature square in the chest. It fell backward with a scream, its body twisting unnaturally as it hit the ground. But the other creature was still there. Eli stood, staggering on unsteady legs, his vision blurred from the blood loss, but he couldn't stop. He fired again, this time grazing the creature's shoulder. It let out another screech, an ear-piercing sound that rattled his bones. Eli didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. His breath burned in his chest as he pushed through the snow, feeling the weight of his injuries slowing him down. Behind him, the creature followed, faster than before. Eli knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up. He glanced over his shoulder, searching for anything that could help him. His eyes locked onto a cliff edge, the rock face rising steeply before him. There was no choice. Eli ran harder, ignoring the scream of his muscles, his body demanding him to stop. The creature was almost upon him, its claws scraping against the ground. He reached the cliff's edge and didn't hesitate. With a final burst of strength, he pushed himself off the ground, leaping into the unknown. For a moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to freeze, suspended in time. Then the ground gave way beneath him. He fell, the wind rushing in his ears, the darkness swallowing him whole. He didn't know how far he fell, only that when he hit the ground, the pain was sharp and all-encompassing. His body crumpled to the earth, his rifle still gripped in his hands. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the creature's distant screech, fading as the world around him melted into unconsciousness. Eli awoke to a sharp, pulsing pain in his head. His body ached like it had been torn apart, his ribs throbbing with every shallow breath. For a few moments, everything was still, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. He blinked, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but the world around him was dark, too dark for his eyes to make sense of anything. He shifted, wincing as his hand brushed against a jagged rock. He tried to push himself up, but his body betrayed him. His legs felt like dead weight, and a dull ache radiated from his side where the creature had clawed him. Slowly, he sat up, his head spinning with each movement. The coldness of the earth beneath him was comforting in a strange way, grounding him. But he knew he couldn't stay here for long. The creatures were still out there, and if they had been close before, they were probably tracking him now. His hand reached for his rifle, still gripped tightly in his left hand. He hadn't let go of it during his fall, a small blessing in a world that had little mercy left to give. He managed to get to his knees, sucking in a painful breath as the world around him shifted. The ground beneath him wasn't solid, it was soft, like he was on the edge of something. He pushed himself forward, dragging his legs beneath him, until his hands brushed against the cold rock wall. A cave, he realized, the walls smooth but jagged in places. He reached for his pack, still strapped to his back, and fumbled with it until he found the last of his water. He took a small drink, wincing as the water did nothing to soothe the dryness in his throat. Eli couldn't afford to waste any time. The creatures were still out there. With shaky hands, he unzipped his coat to check the wound in his side. His fingers brushed over the torn flesh, and the pain surged through him, making him gasp. It wasn't too deep, but it had bled more than he liked. He'd need to find a way to patch it up before it got worse. He took a moment to steady his breath and focus. The forest had swallowed him up, and now he was in its grasp. He wasn't sure how far he'd fallen, but there was no way of telling where the creatures had gone, or if they were still tracking him. He needed to move. He crawled deeper into the cave, the faint sound of his breath and the rustling of his movements the only noise in the otherwise suffocating silence. His fingers brushed against the cold stone walls, and he pushed forward. His head throbbed with each passing moment, and he could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. The silence in the cave was oppressive, a strange stillness that made his every movement feel too loud. The last thing he wanted was to make noise and alert the creatures to his location. He forced himself to slow down, trying to keep his steps measured and quiet. His thoughts flickered back to the settlement, to Leah and her son. He wondered if they had made it through the night. He wondered if they were safe. It didn't matter anymore, though. He couldn't go back. There was no going back. The cave opened up into a small chamber, and Eli froze as he heard something. Footsteps. Not the slow, deliberate steps of the creatures, but the soft, cautious steps of someone else. Someone human. Eli's heart skipped a beat. He pulled himself against the cave wall, trying to make himself invisible in the shadows. His hand closed tighter around his rifle, the only weapon he had left. His mind raced, his pulse hammering in his ears. The footsteps grew louder. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. Eli's instincts screamed at him to run, to hide, to not let this person find him. But there was nowhere to go. Then a voice, soft and cracked with fatigue, broke through the darkness. Are you still alive? Eli's breath caught in his throat. The voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He strained his ears, listening carefully. Don't make any noise, the voice said, a tremor of fear in it. If you're alive, don't let them hear you. They're everywhere. Eli's mind clicked into gear. The creatures. This person knew about them. They had to. He reached out, the words coming out before he could think. Who's there? His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. For a long moment there was silence. Then the figure stepped into the dim light of the cave. It was a man, hunched and thin, his face gaunt, his clothes ragged. His eyes were wide with an anxious, hunted look, and his hand held a crude knife, barely enough to defend himself. Are you alone? The man asked, his voice rough. Eli nodded, though the question felt like a lie. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. I'm alone. The man eyed him warily, but seemed to relax a little. You're the first person I've seen in days. Thought I was the only one left. You don't look much better than me, but at least you're alive. His voice dropped lower, fear creeping in. They're always watching. You have to be careful. I don't know where they come from, but they'll tear you apart if they get the chance. Eli didn't respond immediately. He had enough survival instinct left to know that talking to strangers was dangerous, but the man seemed to know what he was talking about. His mind raced, considering the possibilities. He'd barely escaped from the creatures before, and now this man was talking about them like he'd been living with them. What happened? Eli finally asked, his voice rough. How long have you been here? Too long, the man muttered, sitting down heavily on the cold stone. I've been hiding from them. Ran out of food 2 days ago. Was trying to make it back to the settlement, but... He shook his head, eyes darting around the cave as though the creatures might be just around the corner. I don't know what happened to everyone. It's like they just vanished. Or were taken. Eli felt a cold chill run down his spine. His mind flashed back to the creatures he had encountered. The way they moved, so effortlessly, their glowing eyes. He had no doubt the man was right. These things weren't just animals, they were something worse, something much darker. How do you survive? Eli asked, his voice soft. The man shrugged, a bitter smile on his face. I don't. Not really. I just keep moving, keep hiding. There's no fighting them, not when they swarm. You can only run until they get bored. Eli's pulse quickened. You know where they are? The man didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing in the darkness. Then his expression shifted. I've seen them, out there. They don't sleep, they don't stop. It's like they're looking for something. Maybe they already found it. I don't know. Eli knew the answer. Whatever it was, the creatures were drawn to it. Something, someone, was their target, and if he didn't figure out what that was soon, he would be their next victim. Eli studied the man's gaunt face, searching for any hint of deception, but he saw only exhaustion and fear. The creatures had clearly pushed this stranger to the brink. Eli felt the same weight pressing down on him, the sense that his survival was fragile, a thread that could snap at any moment. We can't stay here, Eli said, his voice low but firm. If they're out there, they'll find this place. They always do. The man nodded slowly, his trembling hands tightening around the crude knife. You're right. They always come. Eli adjusted his pack, wincing as his injured side throbbed. He couldn't afford to slow down. The wound would have to wait. Do you know the area? Is there anywhere safe nearby? The man hesitated, his sunken eyes darting toward the cave's entrance. There's a ridge about 1/2 mile north. Steep, but defensible. I was heading there before. His voice trailed off, and he shivered. Then we head there. Eli said, standing. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small roll of bandages. He offered them to the man. Wrap your hands. If we run into them, I need you to hold steady. The man took the bandages wordlessly, fumbling to wrap his trembling fingers. Eli slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped toward the cave entrance, his every nerve on edge. The forest outside was dark, the moonlight barely piercing the thick canopy of skeletal branches. Shadows stretched long across the snow, and every sound, the crunch of frost, the whisper of wind, felt amplified, like the world itself was holding its breath. Stay close, Eli whispered. The man followed, his movements cautious, his eyes darting to every shadow. They moved through the forest in tense silence, the snow crunching beneath their boots the only sound. Eli scanned the trees constantly, his rifle at the ready. The creatures could be anywhere, their glowing eyes and unnerving speed making them nearly impossible to predict. As they neared the ridge, the forest seemed to grow colder, the air sharper, almost electric. Eli's breath came in quick puffs, his injured side burning with each step. The man behind him muttered something under his breath, his voice barely audible. What? Eli asked, glancing back. The man's eyes were wide, staring at something over Eli's shoulder. They're here. Eli turned, his heart leaping into his throat. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at him from the shadows, followed by another, then another. The creatures moved slowly at first, their long limbs unfolding as they crept closer, their screeches low and guttural. Run! Eli barked, raising his rifle. He fired a shot, the sound echoing through the forest. One of the creatures recoiled, but the others surged forward, their movements unnaturally fast. The man sprinted ahead, but Eli stood his ground, firing again and again. The bullets slowed the creatures, but didn't stop them. One lunged at him, its claws swiping through the air. Eli ducked, the creature's hand grazing the top of his head. He spun, slamming the butt of his rifle into its face. The creature screeched, staggering back, but another was already closing in. Eli turned to run, adrenaline surging through his veins. He caught up to the man, who was clawing his way up the steep incline of the ridge. The creatures were right behind them, their screeches rising in pitch, echoing like a dreadful chorus through the night. Keep moving, Eli shouted, shoving the man upward as he scrambled for handholds in the icy rock. He turned, firing blindly into the shadows. One of the creatures climbed the ridge with ease, its clawed hand reaching for Eli's boot. He kicked out, his heel connecting with its face. It snarled, clawing at him, but Eli fired point blank, the shot ripping through its skull. The creature tumbled backward, crashing into its companions. The climb felt endless, the ridge impossibly steep, but they finally reached the top. Eli collapsed onto the flat ground, gasping for breath. The man was beside him, shaking, his knife still clutched in his hand. The creatures gathered at the base of the ridge, their glowing eyes fixed on Eli and the man. They screeched, pacing back and forth like predators circling prey just out of reach. We're not safe, the man panted, his voice trembling. They'll climb. They always climb. Eli forced himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He looked around, spotting a narrow pathway leading deeper into the ridge. It was steep and treacherous, but it was their only option. This way, he said, pulling the man to his feet. They stumbled down the path, the creatures now, screeches growing fainter behind them. The forest beyond the ridge was dense, the trees pressing in from all sides. Eli knew they couldn't stop, not yet. The creatures would find a way up. They always did. For now, they had bought themselves a little time. But Eli couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were learning, adapting, and that their relentless pursuit was far from over. The forest beyond the ridge seemed alive with tension, every creak of the trees and rustle of leaves setting Eli on edge. He and the man moved in silence, their breaths visible in the frigid air. The narrow path snaked through the dense woods, forcing them to move single file. Eli led the way, his rifle at the ready, eyes scanning for any movement. The man followed close behind, his knife held tightly, though his grip trembled. The ridge was far behind them now, but the feeling of being hunted lingered, oppressive and inescapable. Where does this path lead? Eli asked, his voice a whisper in the stillness. The man hesitated. Don't know, he admitted. I've never been this far, but we can't turn back. Eli frowned but said nothing. He didn't trust the man, not fully, But right now, they were all each other had. He pressed on, the trees around them growing thicker, their skeletal branches entwining like claws overhead. The canopy was dense, blocking out even the pale light of the moon. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the forest itself resented their presence. They walked for hours, their steps slow and deliberate. Eli's side throbbed with pain, the makeshift bandage doing little to stem the bleeding. He felt lightheaded, his limbs heavy, but he forced himself to keep moving. Stopping wasn't an option. Finally, they came to a small clearing. The moonlight broke through the trees here, casting long, pale shadows across the snow-covered ground. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, the windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. The man stopped, his breath hitching. "You think it's safe?" Eli didn't answer immediately. His instincts screamed that nothing was safe, but the cabin offered shelter, at least for a little while. "We'll check it out," he said. "Stay behind me." They approached cautiously, Eli's rifle raised. The cabin door was ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. He nudged it open with the barrel of his rifle, the wood creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of decay and rot. The cabin was small, just one room. A broken table lay overturned in the center, and a pile of old moth-eaten blankets was shoved into one corner. There were no signs of recent activity, no tracks in the dust or disturbances in the clutter. "It's empty," Eli said, though he didn't lower his rifle. "For now." The man slipped inside, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting nervously. "We should barricade the door, just in case." Eli nodded. They worked quickly, dragging the broken table and a few pieces of scattered debris to block the entrance. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Eli slumped against the wall, his energy drained. He pulled off his pack, rummaging for anything that could help. He found a small tin of salve and some clean gauze, remnants of a first aid kit he'd scavenged weeks ago. He unwrapped the blood-soaked bandage around his side, biting back a groan of pain. The wound was worse than he thought, deep and jagged, the flesh around it red and angry. He cleaned it as best he could, applying the salve and wrapping it tightly with the gauze. The pain was blinding, but he forced himself to finish. Infection was a death sentence out here. The man watched silently, his expression a mix of fear and pity. "You should rest," he said finally. "I'll keep watch." Eli shook his head. "We take shifts. Wake me if you hear anything." The man nodded, settling near the barricaded door, his knife in his lap. Eli lay down on the pile of blankets, his rifle within arm's reach. His body screamed for rest, but his mind refused to quiet. Every shadow, every creak of the cabin felt like a threat. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it was shallow and restless. Eli woke to the sound of scratching. His eyes snapped open, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. The man was crouched by the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just at the door, it was at the walls, the windows, all around them. The creatures had found them. Eli got to his feet, his heart pounding. "Get ready," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The first crash came from the window, the glass shattering as a creature lunged through. Its glowing eyes locked onto Eli, its claws slicing through the air. He fired, the shot echoing in the confined space. The creature shrieked, its body jerking violently before collapsing to the floor. But more were coming. The door buckled under the weight of their assault, the barricade groaning as claws tore at the wood. Another creature slipped through a gap in the wall, its movements eerily fluid. The man screamed, slashing wildly with his knife. He managed to wound it, but the creature retaliated, knocking him to the ground. Eli fired again, the bullet striking the creature in the chest. It fell, writhing, but the door finally gave way. The room filled with their screeches, their glowing eyes burning like fire in the darkness. "Run!" Eli shouted, grabbing the man by the arm and dragging him toward the back of the cabin. There was no time to think, no time to plan. They burst through the back door into the freezing night. The forest was alive with movement, the creatures pursuing them relentlessly. Eli fired blindly over his shoulder, the muzzle flash illuminating the chaos. The man stumbled, but Eli pulled him up, their desperate flight continuing. Ahead, the trees thinned, the ground sloping downward. A frozen river glinted in the moonlight, Its surface cracked and uneven. Eli didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward it, the creature's screeches growing louder behind them. The ice groaned beneath their weight, but Eli didn't stop. The creatures followed, their claws skittering on the slick surface. Eli turned, firing his last shots. The ice shattered under the weight of the creatures, sending them plunging into the freezing water below. Eli and the man collapsed on the far bank, gasping for breath. The forest fell silent once more, the creatures gone for now. Eli sat on the frozen bank of the river, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The freezing air burned his lungs, and his injured side throbbed with each shallow breath. Beside him, the man, whose name Eli still hadn't learned, sat hunched over, clutching his knife with trembling hands. The moonlight glinted off the thin blade, but his eyes were fixed on the water where the creatures had disappeared beneath the broken ice. "We can't stay here," Eli said after a moment, his voice hoarse. He struggled to his feet, gripping his rifle for balance. "If they find a way back, we're sitting ducks." The man nodded weakly, dragging himself upright. "Where do we go?" Eli scanned the dense forest beyond the river, every shadow a potential threat. He had no plan, no destination, but moving was better than waiting. "We head east. Keep close." They trudged through the trees, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The forest was eerily silent now, the absence of the creatures' screeches almost more unsettling than their presence. Eli's mind raced as they walked. How long could they keep this up? Supplies were running low, and his injury was slowing him down. If they didn't find shelter soon, they'd freeze, or worse. The faint sound of voices stopped Eli in his tracks. He raised a hand, signaling the man to stay quiet. The voices were muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. Eli's grip tightened on his rifle as he scanned the trees, his heart pounding. "Someone's out there," he whispered. The man's eyes widened. "Could be them," he said, his voice barely audible. Eli shook his head. The creatures didn't speak, they screamed. This was different. Carefully, he moved toward the sound, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The man followed close behind, his knife at the ready. As they crept closer, the voices grew louder, clearer. Eli could make out at least 2, maybe 3 people, their tones urgent but calm. He crouched behind a fallen tree, peering through the shadows. A small group of figures stood in a clearing just ahead, their silhouettes outlined by the pale moonlight. They were bundled in heavy coats, their faces obscured by scarves and hoods. One carried a rifle slung over their shoulder, while another held a lantern, its faint glow casting long shadows across the snow. A third figure knelt on the ground, examining what looked like a map spread out on a log. Scouts, Eli realized, from another camp. The man tugged at his sleeve, his expression panicked. What if they're not friendly? Eli didn't respond immediately. The scouts didn't look hostile, but out here, trust was dangerous. Still, the promise of a settlement, a place with food, medicine, and warmth, was too tempting to ignore. He weighed his options, his mind racing. "I'm going to talk to them," Eli said finally. He handed the man his spare pistol. "If things go south, run." The man swallowed hard but nodded, gripping the pistol like it was his lifeline. Eli stepped out from behind the tree, his rifle held low but ready. "Hey!" he called, his voice firm but not aggressive. "I'm not here to fight." The scouts froze, their heads snapping toward him. The one with the rifle raised it quickly, aiming at Eli's chest. The lantern bearer stepped closer, their face partially visible beneath a heavy scarf. "Who are you?" the lantern bearer demanded, their voice sharp and suspicious. "Just a traveler," Eli said, stopping a few paces away. He kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. "I've been out here too long. Ran into some of those things. We're just looking for shelter." "We?" The rifleman's voice was gruff. His eyes darted past Eli, spotting the man still crouched behind the fallen tree. Eli nodded. "A friend? He's unarmed." The kneeling scout stood, folding the map and tucking it into their coat. "You expect us to believe you're just wandering out here for fun?" they asked, their tones skeptical. Eli sighed. "No one's out here for fun. Look, I don't care who you are or where you're from. We're hurt, we're low on supplies, and we need help. If you've got a camp, we'll pull our weight. Just don't leave us out here." The scouts exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, the lantern bearer lowered their light, stepping closer to Eli. "Fine, But if you try anything, we'll put you down." Eli nodded, relief washing over him. "Fair enough." The rifleman kept his weapon trained on Eli as the group moved toward the man, who stood hesitantly, the pistol still in his grip. "Let's go," the scout said, motioning for them to follow. As they trekked through the forest, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a new set of dangers. Trust was scarce in the post-apocalyptic world, and every interaction carried risks. But for now, they had a chance, a slim one, to survive a little longer. And that was enough.